What's up, guys? Today I'm going to be making a go-kart, but before I do, I'd like to say a few things. One, this build is crazy expensive. So if you want to build this, I'd recommend going on to eBay or Craigslist or whatever and just buying the chassis. Not only is it going to be way safer, it's going to be way cheaper. So anybody who's maybe has a chassis already or doesn't want to do the whole build and wants to buy a chassis somewhere, or maybe you only need help with building certain sections of the go-kart, I split this video into 3 parts. Here's going to be the time that you can skip to if you want to build the chassis and the frame. It'll pretty much be from the beginning of the video. The second part is the steering and the wheels of the go-kart, so anything that makes it move. And then the bottom, this third one, this is going to be how to do the motor, how to do the brakes, how to do everything like that. So if you're having trouble with any of that. Alright, let's get right into it. This is the design that I'm going to be using for the go-kart, helpfully provided to me by my friend Gavin. He did all the calculations for it. These thinner parts, almost everything except for this center bar, is made out of 1 inch by 1 inch square steel tubing. And we're going to need approximately 17 feet of it. 17 feet is accounting for all the excess that you're going to cut off. Hopefully it should be enough, but if you feel like you're really bad at welding and you feel like you need to cut more material off or you might make mistakes, then I'd account for that and get more than 17 feet of material. As I said, we're going to need square tubing. Ours is a little rusty, so we're going to have to clean it off, but you should eventually clean off all of your material anyway to make good welds. And we have a 5-foot length of 1 inch by 2 inch tubing. Let's get started. For the angle grinder, I'm going to be using a hard disc to hopefully clean off really thick scale on the iron. And maybe for the rust, you could use a flap disc, or if you just have some paint, you could use a flap disc. Either one will work, hopefully. You just have to stay persistent and get off all the material to make good clean welds. For the next part, after we've cleaned off all of the scale, which currently is still going on outside, I'm going to cut all of the metal with this jigsaw. It has a metal cutting bit on it, and it actually makes pretty good work of the metal. You can use an angle grinder with an abrasive wheel if you want to cut everything, but the wheels are pretty thick, so you lose a lot of material, as well as there are a lot of angled cuts that need to be made very precisely, and the jigsaw will do a better job of doing that. But if you don't have one, you don't have to go out and buy one. An angle grinder will work for all of the purposes, and if you're just making a simpler design, just like a box or something like that, you really don't need anything fancy. Our blade broke for the jigsaw, so we're gonna have to use the angle grinder now. And this would work really well, but I'm too lazy to go out and buy more blades, and they're pretty expensive, so yep, angle grinder time. So the cuts that you make with the angle grinder are pretty jagged, and we could shore them up again with the angle grinder, but I have a bench grinder, so I'm just going to try to get these as straight as possible so they can all sit really flush and line up very well, so the welding will be easier for me. So that's what I'm going to do now, and then we're going to weld everything together. We have all of the parts cut out, and now it's time to weld. I'm using a flux core MIG welder, which is the easiest type of welder. If you're using anything more complicated, I'm sure you probably know how to use your welder pretty well. But for this, we're just going to use the high temperature because the steel's pretty thick. And just get welding. Finish the chassis, everything's welded together, and now we have to attach this chair. Luckily, on the bottom of the chair, there's a metal bit, so it should be pretty easy just to weld that on. We're now building the steering for the go-kart. The system's going to need about 2 feet of 1 inch by 1 inch steel square tubing that we were using earlier, 2 tires that have an inner diameter bearing of 5/8 inches that need to take at least 300 pounds load. These are about 10 inches long. You're going to need rods, solid steel rods that are 5/8 inch that can fit into this and have excess sticking out from one side and the other. And you'll need 2 rods of that length, 2 wheels of course. Then you'll need 2 threaded rods that are 5/16 inch by 36 inches long ways. You'll need a 1/2 inch by 36 inch steel tubing. The wall thickness is 1/16 inch. You'll need 2 of these. Then you'll need 1 solid steel rod that are 3/8 inch by 36 inches. Another steel tube. This one is 3/4 inch and it also has a 1/16 inch thickness and it's 36 inches long. A threaded rod that I guess it's a bolt technically, but it doesn't have the head on it. This is gonna have to be about 3/4 of an inch so that it can fit inside of this tube. Ours does not fit exactly, so we're gonna have to grind it down to make it perfect. Then you're gonna need 4 of these female rod and right angle ball bearings. These are 5/16 inch and 4 nuts. You'll also need excess steel bar. This is just some leftover steel that I have laying around. This will help to hold the steering column in place, and I'm using about 5 feet just to be safe. And of course you'll also need a steering wheel. You can buy a steering wheel or just use some round object as a steering wheel. Anything works. Let's get to it. First we're going to work on the rotation for the wheels. We're going to build this part here, which is made out of a 3/4 inch tubing, the 5/8 inch axle piece, small piece of scrap metal from the bar, and the 3/8 inch rod. We're going to have to grind this rod so that it fits these bearings. That's the only reason that we're using that size rod. We're also going to need the 3/4 inch rod and threaded rod and 2 nuts. Then we're going to need some of the excess tubing. Of course you'll need the wheel, and you're going to need a drill bit that can drill the size of this. And the way that it's going to work is so this is how the system's attached. The rod goes all the way through and is stationary, while the pipe is able to freely spin in a circle. We will then have this little bearing on here, allowing it to pull and push this mechanism, and the wheel is going to be attached onto the axle, which can then move. The inside diameter of this area is going to be just a little bit larger than the outside diameter of this on your wheel. This allows it to freely move without running into anything. And the length going in, I chose to do 1.5 inches, but it'll be dependent on how deep this goes in and how much axle you have. To start, we're going to drill the holes through the frame and the other tubing. So right now I'm drilling the hole through this bottom frame. I do have my drill press set up right now, but you could do it with a hand drill bit. You just have to be careful and go slowly. I'm going to cut this piece with the hole in it to 3.5 inches, and then I'm going to cut another piece of pipe at 2.5 inches.
to take the 3/4 inch pipe and weld it to the 5/8 inch axle. So that's what I've done right now. I'm giving myself about a 1/2 inch right here on either side, and then we cut it to fit inside the little C that we just made. Now that we have the axle and the tube connected, we have to make this little flat bar part so we can attach this little rod. And I'm also just going to attach a little thing on the bottom to hold it up. I know all these welds are sloppy, but it's better to have a lot more metal than less metal because these are going to be holding the entire cart. I've welded the flat bar on, the supporting piece, and this little post. Again, this was originally just the rod. I stuck it in a drill, I spun it on the drill, and then I took the angle grinder to it and ground it down until the diameter was enough to fit inside one of those little bearings. Now I have to take this threaded rod and make it fit in here. It doesn't fit very well. I'm not removing the threads, I'm just making them a little smaller so that it'll fit in and be able to rotate, but then so that I still have enough for the nuts to bind onto. And the way I'm doing this is with the belt sander. I'm just going to hold it here and spin it. Now we're going to build the steering column. This is going to be comprised of this tube and rod. The tube is going to be attached to the bottom on the frame at a comfortable distance from you and then cut to length. And then inside of that we will put in the rod, which will be longer than the tube and will rotate freely inside of the tube. Then we're going to have to weld a piece onto the bottom, but for now we're just going to cut this pipe to length, cut this rod to length, and weld it on in a comfortable position. There you go for it. A little side note, I haven't swept the garage floor at all, and this is a magnet, and there's just metal all over the ground. So much metal. Alright, let's get on to welding. Cut and welded on this center pipe, but it's a little wiggly, so we have to cut some extra metal into a support, and this is a V-shaped metal piece, so I'm just going to cut and weld like this and have the pipe go over the top of it. If you have just flat bar though, you can just easily weld vertically up just like that, and it'll do the same thing. We have the steering column attached really well with the supporting bar, and now we have this rod that says it's the same diameter, but it comes from Home Depot, so it's not exactly a good fit. So what we're going to do is put it in a chuck of a drill and then just sand it. You can use hand sandpaper if you just wanted to hold it up to it. You can use an angle grinder, but I have a belt sander, so we're just going to run it over that real quick and hopefully it'll match the diameter. Let's get to it. Now I'm going to take tin snips and cut along these lines over here, and I have this little rod that I'm going to weld onto one side like this. First I'm going to take this little piece of metal here, and along these gray lines I'm going to cut, and I'm going to weld this little knob thing on here, and then I'll weld that onto the main steering column, and that'll be the steering. I welded the rod onto a thin piece of steel, and then I doubled up the steel to make it stronger. Now I have the steering column inside the tube, and it's able to freely rotate, and I'm going to weld this on like that, and that should be the steering done. Now we're going to take our threaded rod and we're going to put these little bearing things on the ends of them. We're going to have to cut the threaded rod to fit, and then we'll screw on the bearing onto the end of the threaded rod, and then we'll also cut this pipe, which is the same pipe here, to go around the threaded rod, because these threaded rods are made of zinc, so they're not very strong.
and this should increase the strength and it will be fine. You do that for this side and the other side, then you flare out the tops of these and everything should stay on fine and dandy. To keep these bars for steering on, I'm going to take this washer and I'm going to put it on the top of this rod, and I'm just going to weld that on there, making sure that this steering column itself isn't actually getting welded, and then it'll be able to stay on without falling off, obviously. To keep the wheels on, since there's no type of pin system and since there's no way to screw a nut onto the end of this, I'm just going to take 2 washers, I'm going to put them on the ends, and I'm going to weld this last washer, and that'll hopefully ensure that the other washer doesn't get welded and acts as a spacer, and the wheel itself doesn't get welded and can rotate freely. I'd like to report that for the steering column that had both of the other steering things on them, the center metal bit broke off, so I've decided that a better idea would be to drill a hole through this little metal piece here, and I'm just going to buy bolts and put a bolt through here, and that will be stronger and work a lot better, hopefully. And now we're going to move on to the back. The materials you're going to need for the back wheels, not including any of the sprockets or brakes for the engine, are going to be 2 wheels with an inner diameter of 5/8 inch, and the outer diameter I believe is 10 on these, 10 inches. Inner diameter should not spin. I couldn't find any wheels that didn't have bearings, so I've just welded the bearings on these so that they don't spin, because eventually we're going to need to weld these straight to this rod right here, which is a 5/8 inch rod we're using as the axle. Again, the rods that you buy from the store, if they're not specifically already like axles, they're not perfectly round, so you're going to have to do some sanding to make sure that they can fit these and these bearings. These bearings are pillow block bearings. They're 5/8 inch also. This is the specific name of the bearings if you guys want to look up that exact name. But pretty much I just bought 2 of them and they work pretty well. Then you're also going to need 4 3/8 inch bolts and nuts. So to attach the back wheels, first you're going to want to put all the wheels and the bearings on the axle, and then you're going to want to put everything under the frame. And what I've done is I measured out 1 inch from the back so that the wheels aren't contacting the back. But giving it an extra inch will hopefully keep it from having any way that it can touch the back and flip you by stopping unexpectedly. And then you also want to make sure that with the motor that you have, this axle here isn't too far away from this axle that you're driving with. Otherwise it's going to be kind of difficult to set up and there's going to be a lot of loose chain. And what I've decided is that we need to have actually 3 bearings for the bottom, 1 on each side and 1 in the center column, because otherwise this rod flexes when you attach or when you put any force on it. And this motor is literally just going to be creating as much torque upward as it can to be spinning this rod. And without a center bearing, it's going to be extremely unstable and will most likely bend. So either plan to get a thicker rod with larger wheels, larger bearings, larger everything, which would have been smart, or you can do the 3 bearings. I'd recommend doing 3 bearings nevertheless, just because there's no downside. But that's what we're going to do. So we've set everything up. We have our distances exactly 1 inch from the back. We're pretty sure this is a good place to be from the other axle. And what we've done is zip tied it in place for now, so that we can make sure everything rolls straight. And now we're just going to mark on the bottom, and we're going to drill the holes through the 1 inch bar stock, so that, or the 1 inch square tubing, and attach the bearings permanently. We're not attaching the wheels to the shaft yet, because first we have to do all of the sprockets. Alright, we're going to test the steering in the back. We still haven't attached the wheels, but we just want to make sure everything's really good, and we'll pull it slowly with a car. And if it breaks with the car going real slow, that'd be a lot better than braking with an actual motor on the back and having me flip off and die. So, test 1 of vehicle pretty much constructed. So these are the parts you're going to need for this next part. You're going to need all these sprockets and these brakes. The brakes that I bought are listed here, although I wouldn't buy these because it says that they're only rated for an 80cc gas motorized bike. And well, I don't know how fast you're intending to make your go-kart, but mine is 337 cc's, so really these brakes won't actually be strong enough, and they're all in that box there. And then here's the sprockets and everything that I bought. They're listed here. Here's the type. We're using a number 40 chain, and so there's also the number 40 gears. When it comes to using the gear on the axle, you can't just use a normal gear. You have to have something called a centrifugal clutch. That's this thing right here. It's really beefy and it's expensive, but it's necessary. Otherwise, while the motor is idling, your vehicle will move. This allows it to idle without moving. And you can adjust the idle on your motor so that it idles slower. You can look it up easily. Just look up two-stroke engine, adjust idle, or anything else depending on the motor that you have, so that it doesn't move while you're just sitting in the vehicle and it's running and you're not throttling it. There is a website online. If you just look up a sprocket optimizer, it'll show how efficient with the motor that you have and how fast you can get yourself going. The motor is beefy 11 horsepower power washer motor, and currently what we're going to be doing is creating a bracket so that the motor sits on the Go Kart on the back, and then attaching all the gears and everything to it. There are 2 bolts on each side of the motor that are exactly where these metal bars are placed. One metal bar goes across the entire frame, and we're gonna have to drill 2 holes to hold that, and then the other bar we're gonna cut to length, and it'll only go from half of the frame and then a little more in order to account for the other hole here that the motor is then going to be mounted on, and then the gear will be somewhere around here and the chain will be there and the brakes will be wherever. But right now we're working on welding this on here, and having the 2 holes drilled through it, and then mounting the motor onto the cart. And we have the bars cut to length now, at the proper length. I've drilled holes, and I finally attached the motor to the bars. Now I'm just putting these bars down here, and then I'm going to weld them on. And once they're welded on, then the motor's attached. Now that we have the motor mounted, I have the sprocket attached with a keyway, and this bottom sprocket needs to be attached. I'm running the chain around both sprockets in order to make sure that they're in line, and then I'm going to weld through both sides of the sprocket. This weld is extremely important, and I think that the proper way of doing this would actually be to have a thicker rod or a thicker axle, and then drill through both the sprocket and the axle, put a pin through both of them, and then ensure that it's extremely solid so that nothing can move, and then weld it. I don't have any other options right now, so it's not the brightest idea for me to be welding this and then hoping that it'll stay, but it's the only option that I have. We attach the chain. If there's any slack in your chain and it doesn't line up perfectly, you can put washers under the motor and then lift it up a little bit, and that'll create it, that'll make it a little bit tighter. Now we're gonna work on the braking system. For the brake disc, to attach it, since it doesn't have a clean surface on the inside and we're not attaching it directly to the wheel, we're gonna have to use this washer. This is a 5/8 inch washer. We'll set it down, weld this on top, and then weld this 1/2 inch nut on here. And then we'll have a lot of surface for the nut to weld onto and the washer to weld onto, and hopefully that'll hold the whole thing in place very well. And it'll look something like this. I know the welds are all really crappy on this, but for the most part it's just a lot of steel to hold it in, and then we'll just weld it on this side and on this side, and it'll sit right there. And you want to make sure that everything is centered really well, otherwise this will spin unevenly and it won't work at all. I'm going to be attaching both brakes on the same side of the axle. Although this will end up tilting the vehicle or turning it off to the side a little bit when you brake, I don't think it's going to be that big of a difference because you're going to be holding onto the wheel, but we'll see. For now, I've lined up the tubing with the other tubing at a 90 degrees, and I've clamped the brake disc onto it to ensure that it's hopefully perpendicular to the axle and everything's lined up perfectly. And then I'm going to weld it all into place, and then you'll have your brakes, and we'll have to work on the caliper setup. To attach the calipers, we're going to use an extra bar, and we're going to place it on the bottom here and weld it here or bolt it. And then we have to grind down the bottom of one of these calipers
calipers, because the caliper itself is like this, and then you're supposed to jam a thing between these two washers, and that's what holds the calipers. But for this, we're just grinding it flat so it'll sit on the bar. We put the caliper right on top of it, and it sits right there, and then it's ready to pull the brake. So now that this bar is welded here, I've also welded on the bottom bracket for the caliper. I lined up the caliper the best that I could so that it wasn't running too much into the disc. I couldn't get it perfect, but hopefully as the machine runs more, the calipers will grind down a little bit and they won't be touching very much. The next step is just to attach the caliper and repeat it again for the other brake. Now both calipers are mounted, they just have 2 screws in them and they're ready to operate, and then the wires are just run through. Now that the calipers are attached, the last step to finishing the car, other than hooking up the brakes and the throttle, the final step here is to weld the wheels directly onto the axle so that when there's power to the axle, the wheels spin, and when you stop the axle, the wheels stop. So now that the calipers are attached, just as simple as just running the wires onto the system and onto the handle itself, and then you just have both brakes. I wouldn't recommend trying to splice the wires together because that will make them weaker, so it's easier just to use 2 brakes. If you have expertise in that, or if you have a wire that splits into 2, then go ahead and use that, but the safest bet is just to use 2 separate brakes. So we have the vehicle jacked up so that we can test the wheels and the centrifugal clutch to make sure everything works. So we're gonna run it now, and if the wheels spin, then we have a problem. So we tested the brakes, we tested the spinning, we've adjusted the idle. Everything works 100% properly. All we have to do is just make sure that the system is really solid, nothing's gonna snap off, and then we can test it. The way that we're doing the throttle pedal is we've got this really big horse gate hinge, and then we have one of these springs that's gonna pull it inward, so it's constantly pulling it back. But for the cable, we got this gate kit, and the way it's gonna work is it's gonna be fairly bolted right here, and it'll push like this against the spring will pull it back, and at the same time it'll be pulling on the cable. The cable already has these little things to hold it in place in the kit, and all you have to do is run the line to the back to the throttle, and it'll throttle the vehicle. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I know this video is really long, and I know there's a ton of things that I did incorrectly on this go-kart, but it ended up working and I had a fun time building it. So I'll see you next time on the next build. I'm out.